Hello and welcome to the Barrel Age Faith. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Edith Humphrey. I've been looking forward to having her on for a long time because we focus so much on C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien on this show. And she's written a wonderful book, among many, many other books, Further Up and Further In, Orthodox Conversations with C.S. Lewis on Scripture and Theology. So welcome to Barrel Age Faith, Dr. Edith. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine, and it's really good to be with you.
I should also say this is the greatest part. You have 28 grandkids. Do I have the number right, or have you added?
No.
Maybe an outdate. That's on your website, so we'll have to add the numbers.
I have 23, but I will have 25 by the end of the year.
Maybe I misread on the website. I copied and pasted. I'll have to fix that. So that's the most important thing. You've been richly blessed, is what I'm saying, with your grandchildren. And you're also, let me read your bio because I've got there's so many wonderful things. You still have a very active podcast called, there it is, The Lamp for Today, which is looking at the Old Testament through the eyes of Jesus and the apostles.
Mm-hmm.
And you're also the professor emerita of New Testament, Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And I'm going to encourage everyone who's watching this to go to her website, edithhumphrey.com. You can find it in the description of this interview, where there's just loads and loads of wonderful journal articles and her books, and you can explore all the things that she's done. But today, we're talking about C.S. Lewis and Holy Orthodoxy. So, reading C.S. Lewis over the last several years, I've noticed even though he wasn't Orthodox, he was Anglican, devout Anglican, I've noticed his Orthodox tendencies or instincts kind of coming through. And reading through your book, you also see those same instincts. So why is this the case? Since he was Anglican and had such little contact with Orthodoxy, why does it seem he has Orthodox instincts?
Right. I mean, that's the thing that a lot of people have asked. In fact, some have even talked about him as an anonymous Orthodox. I think that's going too far, and we can talk about why that is towards the end of the interview. But you're right, he didn't have much continuing contact with Orthodoxy, but he does tell us about a holiday that he took in Greece and how transported he was by the beauty and the authenticity of the divine liturgy that he attended there and the people who worshipped. And this is over against the experience that he also recounts of his worship in Anglican context, probably a low Anglican church, although he did have some high Anglican friends, including a priest who was his confessor. But I'm pretty sure he was going to a fairly kind of middle of the line, low Anglican church. And he actually found worship there to be difficult, though he was continuously faithful. I think it's most likely that his compatibility with Orthodox theology and with our approach as Orthodox to the faith comes from his reading of the Church Fathers, and also from his deep desire not to be branded by a particular denomination of Christianity. He talked about mere Christianity, as many people know. He wanted to present the truth and his and other Christians' experience of Christ as it had been shaped by what we would call or could call the great tradition. So Anglicans, after all, though they are a mixed group, do place special emphasis upon corporate prayer and upon personal piety and upon what has been given to the church, or was given to us, at least in the first four councils. Also, in his day job, he was a professor of medieval English, and so that literature is quite obviously influenced by the ancient fathers of the church, both East and West. He was not a sola scriptura Christian, though he had great reverence for the scriptures as interpreted by the historic church. And I think his entire work also, we could show this in every one of his pieces, is marked by an attention to the incarnation on the one hand and to the Holy Trinity, those two twin treasures that George Herbert, the poet, the 17th century poet, talks about. And I think these two emphases on the incarnation and the Holy Trinity alone bring him very close to the Orthodox phronema.
Very good. I've wondered, and maybe there's a good journal article on this or book that I just haven't run across, but it's more of a technical question on to what extent he was familiar with the fathers and reading their firsthand, primary source accounts. Like, I know he wrote the introduction to St. Athanasius' translation by his friend, and he, of course, has read the fathers, but to what extent is he aware of, like even someone like St. Maximus the Confessor? I mean, there's been so many translations a lot of it was happening during his own lifetime.
So So somebody was very disappointed that this book was not that. And they were expecting it because I talk about conversations with C.S. Lewis, Orthodox conversations, and they were expecting that I would go through and show all the different places where he has indebtedness. Now, I have not gone through his correspondence. It would have to be his private correspondence carefully with an eye to which church fathers he mentions by name. That would be the absolute evidence, right?
Right.
But his introduction to Athanasius on the Incarnation does say a good deal about his attitude towards the fathers in general. In that introduction, he speaks with great affection and respect for that saint whose book he's introducing. And he reminds us that Saint Athanasius stood for the Trinitarian doctrine, whole and undefiled, when it looked as if the whole civilized world was slipping back from Christianity into a religion like that of Arius. And that's something that he thought was also happening in his own day. And in that preface, he also commends the saint's general approach to miracles as a retelling in clear letters of what God does generally for our world, rather than as kind of an arbitrary incursion into a fixed and God-free nature. And we see the influence of Athanasius then in his little but very profound book, Miracles. Certainly, he did absorb the teaching and the approach of the fathers through his reading of medieval works. He also would have been familiar with many of them through the liturgy and hymnody of the Anglican Church, particularly the influence of the likes of Keble and Newman, even though he wasn't high church, and John Mason Neale, all of whom worked to recover ancient hymns from the East as well as from the West. And then, of course, the Anglican communion services, the offices, and some of the prayers they're frequently dependent upon the likes of St. John Chrysostom. We do know from his commending of old books to others in that preface to Athanasius that he was intimately familiar with St. Athanasius and St. Augustine and the Western theologian Aquinas. And Aquinas has a certain a slant, a Thomist slant, we call it now, that's not Orthodox, but he still does retain much of the earlier fathers, both East and West. Then we can deduce from details in his novels and nonfiction that he knew, and I think I could demonstrate this, St. Ambrose, St. Dionysius, St. Irenaeus, and St. Gregory the theologian, and possibly others, maybe Maximus, maybe not. He does speak about, for example, the expulsion from the garden as a severe mercy meant to help rather than to punish. That's clearly Eastern thought. He speaks of evil as a privation of goodness, found in Augustine and others. That is a distortion or a lack rather than a thing in itself. He emphasizes theosis in many places, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that. He speaks about the first parents, Adam and Eve, as being young, and that's in line with St. Irenaeus. And until we have Theosis, I think he almost certainly alludes to the Paschal Stichera, where we're enjoined to call even those who hate us brother. And I find that a fascinating little detail in one of the vignettes of that novel. So he commended his devotion to the ancient theologians to others. One call out, just remind those who are watching who've heard this, or those who haven't seen it. I think this is an incredible confession of his own. He says, and this is again from the introduction to St. Athanasius, there is a strange idea abroad that in every subject the ancient books should be read only by the professionals, and that the amateur should content himself with the modern books. The student is half afraid to meet one of the great philosophers face to face. He feels himself inadequate and thinks he will not understand him. This mistaken preference for the modern books and the shyness of the old ones is nowhere more rampant than in theology. Wherever you find a little study circle of Christian laity, you can almost be certain that they're studying not St. Luke or St. Paul or St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas or Hooker or Butler, but Monsieur Berdiev or Monsieur Maritain or Monsieur Niebuhr or Miss Sayer or even myself, which I think is quite fun. So there he tips his hand to some of the people that he thinks that we should be looking at, but of course he looked at many others.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny to read that quote because now we do throw kind of like C.S. Lewis and Sayer in there, Well, at least I do with the greats that I enjoy reading. It's such a good quote by him. I also noticed when I was doing a little comparative study when I was studying Saint Irenaeus on hell being like a quarantine and a mercy out of the garden. It's like, oh
Yep,
man, Lewis sounds just like that. And
really
it's
does. Absolutely.
and so thanks for bringing that up.
So, I mean,
When we
these are
get
echoes. You couldn't prove it, but certainly he's imbibed the spirit, and I think he's actually read some of these.
hmm Yeah, I certainly believe that too, but it is difficult to prove it at an academic level that would be worthy of a journal article or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, so some have said there was one scholar in particular, but I can't think of his name, who said that theosis is one of the major themes of mere Christianity. And I remember reading that line at first and be like, "Oh, it is." And then the more that I poured over mere Christianity, I'm like, "This is a dominant theme." I think I would like to see your opinion. Do you think theosis is a major theme in mere Christianity, becoming a partaker of the divine nature,
Well,
even though he never uses that word quite theosis in
it,
it?
it is it is certainly a major theme in Lewis's writings as a whole. But yes, I think that the argument could be made that it's major in mere Christianity as well. In mere Christianity, he says quite plainly, the command be ye perfect is not idealistic gas, nor is it a command to do the impossible. He's going to make us into creatures that can obey that command. He said in the Bible that we were gods, and he's going to make good his words. If we let him, for we can prevent him if we choose, he will make the feeblest and the filthiest of us into a god or goddess, dazzling, radiant, immortal creature, pulsating all through with such energy and joy and wisdom and love as we cannot now imagine. A bright stainless mirror which reflects back to God perfectly, though of course on a smaller scale, his own boundless power and delight and goodness. The process will be long and in parts very painful, but that is what we are in for, nothing less. He meant what he said. And if I remember correctly, that comes out of his little, that comes as an explanation of his little parable where he says we thought that he was going to make us into a nice little cottage, but he's actually making a castle, and that means things are being knocked down and run up in a most alarming way. So, I mean, I absolutely think it's an important theme in mere Christianity, although mere Christianity, I think actually the most important themes, as I said before, are incarnation and Trinity. And there's no doubt that this is a major theme etched on Lewis's imagination, probably through his reading of St. Athanasius, who said he was incarnate, he took on flesh that we might be made God. And we can see it in the Great Divorce, we can see it in Paralandra, we can see it until we have faces, and we can see it touched upon even in the last battle for children. And in his prose, he has all kinds of interesting things, specific things to say about our salvation being more than just escape from hell and death, but it's the taking on, the participation in the divine life. When he speaks about the sacraments, he says God uses material things to put the God life in us. That reminds me of Schmemann's approach to the sacraments and to this world being sacramental. And he warns us that if we were to see a glorified human being as he or she will be in the eschaton, we might be tempted to worship. We would be so frightened. And that picture, I think, comes through beautifully in the Great Divorce, in the picture of Sarah, who is brimful with the immensity of life, and who has this unshaking joy that attracts all kinds of creatures and people to her. And then the vignette that really comes to my mind is the one in Paralandra, where we see the Adam and Eve figure, the man and woman figure in Paralandra, walking hand in hand with their bodies shining like emeralds. And they come into sight. And at that point, the gods, that is the Eldils, the angels, bow their huge bodies before the small forms of that king and queen. And then, of course, who can forget till we have faces where Oruel, who's in her final trial before the god, actually ends up gaining a face. She bows before this god, and she's raised up in beauty. She's learned to die before she died, and she's now fully radiant. So I think it's everywhere, but I think it is an important theme, a significant theme in mere Christianity. But the prize of themes goes to a concentration upon who Christ is and who God is.
Yes, yes. I can really pick it up in his fiction. He's able just to articulate and draw images out that look like, okay, this is what union with God looks like. That phrase pulsating with energy. Many traditions talk about union with God or talk about deification, but that phrase pulsating with energy sounds so much the way that an Orthodox Christian would talk.
Yeah.
Um, how close do you think his articulation of theosis and union with God is compared to an Orthodox understanding? How close does he get to an Orthodox understanding, do you think?
Pretty close. I mean, and it's not something except for that one little bit in Mere Christianity that he takes on explicitly in his apologetics. I think because he was very concerned not to be controversial in his apologetics. But as you say, it's something that he can do in his novels because people can grasp what the imagination, what their minds might be resistant to. But I think that the way that he describes this as the natural corollary of God becoming a human being, and as the fulfillment of God's call for us to be stewards of this world in his stead, and not simply to be rescued from the mess that we put ourselves in, but to even go beyond that. That's very Orthodox. So Orthodox don't have this sense of a V shape to salvation where there's paradise lost and paradise regained, and it stops there. But there's paradise lost, paradise regained, and then it becomes a check mark going on. And one does get this sense in, say, a book like The Great Divorce or the children's novel, The Last Battle, that this is something that continues and that will continue until eternity, that we become more and more and more and more like God. And that is certainly a very Orthodox view. Many of the fathers speak about not the static bliss of heaven and the rest of heaven, though those themes are there, but of the drawing closer and closer to God.
Mm. Yeah, it reminds me of Saint Gregory of Nyssa, who talks about like that forever reaching out.
Yep.
And Lewis he really embodies that with this further up and further in, as you know, the title of your book. This growth and ever reaching out, and even though that is otherworldly, it also has something to do with this world, as you talk about in chapter 2. It connects to our responsibility to be stewards of creation, and you use the phrase over and over again, sub-creation and sub-creators. What do you? And you were just touching on that. How does our participation in the life of God, theosis, connect to subcreation and participating in the subcreation that Tolkien talks so much about too?
Right, and a lot of people actually attribute that term to Tolkien, and he may have been the first to coin it, who knows, but it was used by Lewis and by Tolkien frequently. I mean, I think if we were following Lewis in particular, it would be, and you could see this in Tolkien too, actually, but especially in Lewis, he takes pains that we not take the theme of subcreation with utter solemnity. Our being makers, in a sense, does echo the creation of God, but Lewis is always careful to speak about the human efforts with humility, especially his own human effort of writing, and also with a little bit of humor. So he's not of the opinion, like some serious Orthodox and non-Orthodox Christians today, that art will be the savior of the world or beauty will save the world, as some are today. For him, it's the beautiful one, the truthful one. It is Christ and the triune God who saved the world.
Mm.
But still, to make or to create under obedience to God is something that's utterly human. It shows that we have become God's sons and daughters, that we have returned to that trust that was given to us at the beginning. And he thinks that there are many ways to engage in this, from gardening, right, to the writing of a book. And he doesn't think that one is more important than the other. Your
comment about not taking it too seriously reminded me. I just got back from the from Lake Michigan with my kids, and my son wanted to build a Notre Dame sandcastle on the beach, and he's like 4 years old. He's obsessed with churches, by the way, and he loves the Orthodox church that we go to. It's beautiful. It inspires worship. But he's like, I want to build that on the beach. And I'm like, well, buddy, we might need to lower our
Yeah.
our expectations here, because I don't know if I can build those towers. And but it made me think of that. We're taking this thing so seriously,
Yeah.
being a sub creator, and he wants to build this beautiful thing out of love and out of pure joy. And that seems kind of like more how Lewis depicts this sort of building with creation.
Yeah, I mean, you can see Lewis's appreciation of this in the creation of Narnia. So Aslan sings Narnia into existence, and then towards the end of that act, one of the creatures delightedly declares that he's made the first joke. And somebody remarks, well, maybe you are the first joke. And then later on, when the battle with the White Witch is about to begin, a Narnian lion takes great pride in the task that's assigned to him by Aslan, because Aslan has used the term us lions, and he runs around saying us lions, and it's very comic. So throughout his book, there are references to literature and to writing and to human subcreation, and he uses these references as parts of the plot, not just as gratuitous citations. Think, for example, of the huge letters under me in the silver chair and the importance of them. And those are human writing, right? The best king in Narnia is chosen. He's a humble man who promises that he won't vaunt his place over the other animals, but really care for them justly. And so for Lewis, story, myth, creation, poetic creation are all ways of, they're all keys to human life, if you like, to showing what human life is like. And yet they point to something even greater. They point to the creator. Lewis uses myth to gesture to the one who is the truth. For grown-ups, the pagan theology of Orwell's world, Until We Have Faces, points to the time when we hear this little thing, the gods will be seen as who they really are, as beautiful. Actually, we know who he is, one God who is beautiful and who's the lover of mankind. So, I mean, that we are sub-creators by nature points to the creator before us, but also to the future when we'll be like him. Why? Because we'll see him as he is. And Lewis is very aware that Jesus is in the center, not human beings as sub-creators, and heavens never co-creators, as some people in our day would like to call us.
Yeah. Participating in sub-creation, maybe that's a better way to go about it. Yeah, I like that. When you made the comment about the creature who has become the first joke of Narnia, it almost kind of makes it seem like Narnia is being birthed in joy and laughter, the dance. It made me think of the Great Divorce, where the lady, she's grumbling her whole life, and then she becomes a grumble.
Yes.
It contrasts with that in my mind when you said that. And it kind of leads to our next question, where, Lewis takes union with God seriously, and our participation in sub-creation and seriously, but he also takes it seriously when we reject that call. How does he depict that in his fiction and nonfiction of, dehumanization or dissent or theosis, if you want to call it that?
Well, I mean, I would say that he does it both with great abandon sometimes, but also with great care, if you can do both. I mean, he's when he paints the picture of dehumanization, it's absolutely clear what he's doing, but he's also quite careful. He goes right up to the line in that hideous strength. Now, it does look like there are kind of two possible results of when a human being, and I'm saying possible results of, or maybe two stages of devolution, one worse than the other, when human beings reject God and his calling, and we're called to care for the earth, to be benevolent caretakers of the animals, and to name them and to nurture them. Well, Uncle Andrew, for example, let's take the kids' book. In the first chronologically of the Narnian Chronicles, the magician's nephew considers his own self-important experiments to trump any claim that, say, his guinea pigs actual guinea pigs, or even two very important children, and he claims that they would have to safety or to happiness. Now, of course, Uncle Andrew is really more concerned with himself than his experiments. The experiments are kind of a projection of his own desire for importance. And when he chooses that path, he becomes naturally terrified of real goodness. And he pulls away from Aslan into self-absorption, and he closes in on himself. The technical term is he becomes curvatus in se, curved in upon himself, and actually gets to the point where he's mistaken for a kind of a vegetable or a tree by the Narnian animals, because he won't speak, he won't, and they think that his hair is kind of like roots of a tree, so they try to plant him the other way around with his head down. Another example that's not comic, but a little frightening, might be seen in that little pretentious ghost in The Great Divorce. That one who's, he thinks he's holding on by a chain, but he's actually connected. And this fake presentation of himself, also a ghost, becomes larger and larger, and he becomes smaller and smaller until finally he just simply disappears between two blades of grass. And then there's Weston, the unman, who from his mutilation of frogs on Paralandra to his end, where he's stopped and literally ends up in a lake of fire, volcanic fire, he shows us what happens when you turn your back on God and try by your own self-will to establish what you want. It even gets worse with his cronies who are still alive on Earth, and we see a horrifying ending of Frost and of Withers, who have left everything aside in that hideous strength, everything that's human. And they give themselves to the darkness in what seems an apt but heartbreaking ending. It's clear that Lewis was not what we could call a positive universalist, because he can give us these vignettes, he can give us these warnings. He did take the Christian teaching about judgment seriously, but also I think that he did hope that all might be saved, like von Balthasar. We can see that in this conversation about that ghost man who disappears in The Great Divorce, where his narrated or fictional MacDonald says that only one has become great enough to become small enough to go between the blades of grass and rescue him, if he will be rescued. So there's always that condition. And Lewis, I think, would not approve of the kind of writing that we've had recently by, say, for example, David Bentley Hart. But I think he would, and he's actually quoted by him, he would appreciate von Balthasar and the hope that we might have, and pray for any particular person that they might turn and they might escape that ending.
Yeah, there's a letter that I ran into. I think he wrote it towards the end of his life, but anyways, he explicitly rejects universalism, because I think I forget who it was. I have it in one of my articles. I'll reference that. But he had a scholar friend who was inquiring, are you like George MacDonald? And he pretty much says no.
No, I mean, he rewrites George MacDonald to be the way that he hoped that MacDonald might now see it. now that he is in that country, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Let me do just a quick follow-up question, since we've just moved on to the topic of hell. It seems to me that he does, talking about the shrinking and the disappearing, he does seem to take kind of some language and he almost takes almost annihilationism language, and he almost kind of pushes that up to the line. Do you see that as well? Is he a quasi-annihilationist? Is there a view of the fathers that actually might best represent his view?
Yeah, so no more than the book of Revelation is. It's the second death. The lake of fire is the second death. So when you're using pictures, when you're trying to talk about a mystery, even a evil mystery, even a very difficult mystery, you speak about it in many different ways. And so I think that for Lewis, our personhood is so fully dependent upon God that if we try to cut ourselves off from the Lord, the giver of life, we cease to be what we are meant to be. But I think it would be wrong to say that Lewis was a full proponent of annihilationism, that judgment is simply eternal death, full stop. I mean, consider Ransom makes a memorial even to Weston in the caverns of Paralandra. If he ceased to be, why would you do that? So God gives even to those who were rebellious the dignity of addressing them as persons. And we get that sense until we have faces. He is the judge. He remains the judge. He's not simply the one who allows us to die an inevitable death. It's not just that we take a consequence, though that's part of it, a natural consequence of the way we live, but also that he is the actor. We're separated from him. We've made that, but also he enacts judgment. And as Orthodox, we have the Sunday of Judgment as a reminder that this is an important theme. And somehow in scripture and in our tradition, these two things jostle uncomfortably side by side. And we're speaking of a mystery, but a dark one. How can a human being made in the image of God simply cease to be? But then also, how could the all-loving God judge so as to put that one in eternal torment away from him? So the Orthodox tradition, as well as the Bible, speak of this awful possibility in various ways. And so does Lewis, cognizant that God is sovereign, but also that we have human freedom. And Lewis certainly was no Calvinist and thought that freedom is an irrevocable dignity that God has given to us. Lewis then is consonant, I would say, with the Orthodox tradition in that he sees the necessity of allowing that route of cutting oneself off from God and being judged that way to be open to human beings. And he's also consonant with it when he pictures God as the judge before whom each of us will stand. So these two are held together, our choice and God as judge. In my book, I actually do try to work out some parameters within which we can safely talk about this mystery, this dilemma, without going beyond orthodoxy. And actually, the building of parameters is, I hope, an Orthodox move. Is the kind of thing we see in the Creed or in the Father's descriptions of the ineffable God. So I think there are certain things that we can say aren't true, but it's very difficult to say what hell is, particularly when it is the absence of God. How do you talk about something that is absence? Yeah. So, I think that Orthodox and Lewis together would love to see that the warnings of the scriptures work for everybody, and that at the end, everyone would respond. But Lewis won't prognosticate on this, nor do the scriptures, nor do most of the fathers, because that would be to take the teeth out of the warning, to go beyond the scriptures and the great tradition. Some people. If some people will hell, and we pray that that will not be the case, this would be a situation in which human freedom and God's action come together. And so it's very serious. And we do pray for those who are resistant to God, that they will not continue to take those steps.
Would you say that he really seems to emphasize the theme, since you're a biblical scholar as well, it's like, does he seem to emphasize really that theme of exile as a big form of hell?
Frankly, I don't see him doing that as much as I do this process of dehumanization. Even in the Great Divorce, the exile is self-imposed. These people in the gray city don't want to be together and move further and further apart. It's very strange. I haven't actually done a study of exile in Lewis since a very important teacher in my life was Tom Wright, for whom that's an extremely important theme.
Right.
So now you spurred me to do a little bit more. But honestly, when I think about it, there are some. There is Bardia, who's in exile in Orwell's country. There is some exile in Pilgrim's Regress. But I don't see it as a major theme. Not just asking me offhand. I don't see it.
Yeah, I was just curious. The Great Divorce made me think of it the most, as far as, but you're right. It's always self-imposed. Yeah, it's self-imposed. And then they're drifting apart in their own sort of self-imposed.
Or deliberately building apart because they can't stand being around others, right?
Right. Right. It's their own self-collapse, their own self-isolation. It's all of those things. And Lewis seems to say similar things. It's all self-imposed. So
except he will not give away the idea of God as judge. You know, that I think that he doesn't. It's not simply that this is a process that we set in motion and that just happens. God actually does have a sovereign will in this. I think that he would not be happy with the idea that hell is simply our choice.
There's a decree, maybe decrees attached to it somehow,
Yeah,
from the divine council or something like that.
And just look at what happens throughout the Great Divorce, or not the Great Divorce, throughout the Chronicles of Narnia. You know, Aslan makes decisions. Things happen. Yes, people's choices involved, but it's not like God's hands are tied and we are just the ones who are the actors. He is the great actor.
That's why I love this fiction. You see all these principles at play, and then you get it in this narrative, and it helps us kind of flush it all out. That's good.
Yep.
So let's get to the let's touch on the atonement. This whole episode's not about Lewis and the atonement, but he of course talks about, you know, we see Aslan die.
Yep.
And it's one of the first introductions for kids about, you know, from Narnia, about Jesus Christ and Aslan. And so how does Lewis approach the atonement? How does it relate to Orthodoxy? How do we see, you know, not just Christus Victor and ransom theory all at play, but also there's the theme of sacrifice. How does he unite all those themes?
So we do tend as Orthodox, and this also occurs with modernist Protestants for different reasons, to downplay the juridical and the sacrificial pictures of atonement, which are all the way through the scriptures, and which, by the way, are found in many fathers. I don't quite understand why some in Orthodox have downplayed sacrifice. I get why they want to downplay justification, although I think they're wrong. But I don't understand how they can really downplay sacrifice given the emphasis upon this in our liturgy. It's just, our liturgy is full of it, right? Yes, it's a bloodless sacrifice, but it's still sacrifice. And it's awesome. And the priest is very reverent, and so are the people. So until we have faces, and in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we see both the hero, the Christus Victor picture, which is used to talk about the atonement, and we see the sacrificial picture. And these are different facets, if you like, of how things are made right, how things are saved. So until we have faces, we have the two sisters, Oruel and Psyche. Psyche, who dies as a sacrifice, or doesn't actually, whether she died or not is not clear, but she's meant to die as a sacrifice. And Oruel, who is like the Christus Victor, like the hero, who saves her people. In Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, everybody sees the lion on the table, but how many people notice the matching vignette when the victorious lion comes and vanquishes the witch? Right, so there is and he goes and he unfreezes, and then he releases the whole of Narnia. So we have both pictures there. Now, Lewis insists that there are many ways that we should consider the miracle of atonement, and I concur with him. Paul often uses several metaphors, sometimes 4 or 5 in the space of a few verses. And lest we think that this is only Western and not Eastern, this is lengthy, but please listen to this passage from St. John Chrysostom's sermon on the ascension of Jesus Christ. And that's an amazing thing that it comes about here. And listen for the language of punishment, listen for the language of sacrifice, but listen to how it also is joined with other views of how we are brought to God. So he says, so that you may learn that he, that is God, did not hate our nature, but that he was turning away evil. Remember that we who appeared to be unworthy of the earth because of the fall were this day through the ascension brought up to the heavens, because Christ took his body with him. For we who were from the beginning not even worthy of what was below have come up to the kingdom on high. We have gone beyond the heavens. We have grasped hold of the royal throne. So there's that theme of theosis. He goes on, even that very human nature, on account of which the cherubim had to guard paradise, this day is seated above the cherubim. But how has this great wonder happened? How did we, who were stricken, who appeared unworthy of the earth and were banished below from the earliest stages, how did we come up to such a height? How was the battle, there's the language of battle, destroyed, and how was the wrath of God lifted? How? For this is the very wonderful thing, that it wasn't we who had grown unjustly angry with God who made the appeal, but that one who was justly vexed, who called us to his side, who entreated us, who made peace. For on Christ's behalf we are ambassadors, as though God were entreating you through us. There he quotes Paul. What is this? Is the one who is himself abused the very same one who encourages? Indeed, yes, for he is God. And because of this, our man-loving Father entreats us, and look what happened. The Son of the one who is making the appeal is the mediator, not a human, nor an angel, nor an archangel, nor any one of the household slaves. And what did this mediator do? The work of a mediator, for it's as if two had been turned away from each other, and since they were not willing to talk together, another one comes and, placing himself in the middle, loosened the hostility of each of the two. And this is also what Christ did. God was angry with us, for we were turning away from God, our human loving master. Christ, by putting himself in the middle, exchanged and reconciled each nature to the other. And how did he put himself in the middle? He himself took on the punishment that was due to us from the Father, and endured both the punishment from there, from heaven, and the reproaches from here, that is, from earth, from human beings. Do you want to know how he welcomed each? Paul says that Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. You've seen how he received from on high the punishment that had to be borne, but look how also from below he received the insults that had to be borne. Haven't you seen how he dissolved the enmity, how he did not depart before doing everything, before suffering and completing the whole business, until he brought up the one who is both hostile and at war, brought that one up to God himself and made him a friend. And of these good things, this very day of the ascension is the foundation. Receiving, as it were, the first fruits of our nature, Christ bore it up in this way to the Master. And indeed, just as it sometimes happens in the case of plains that bear ears of corn, it happens here. Somebody takes a few ears and, making a little handful, offers it to God, so that because of this little amount, God blesses the whole land. Christ also did this. Through the one flesh and first fruits he made to be blessed our whole race. Therefore, he offered up the first fruits of our nature to the Father, and the Father was so amazed with the offering, both because of the worthiness of Christ who offered it, and because of the blamelessness of the offering, that he received the gift with his hands that belonged, as it were, to the same household as the Son, and he placed the offering close to himself, saying, "Sit at my right hand." I just think that's amazing, because here we have Jesus is the one who received punishment. He's the hero, he's the reconciler, he's the first fruit offering, and it's all wrapped up together. And I really think it's important to know that our disagreement with Western theology should be on the undue emphasis that's placed on substitutionary atonement and the legal metaphors like justification, not on the ideas themselves. They're very clear in Scripture. They're found in the Fathers. But if we take all the metaphors together, we get a fuller picture of what Christ has done and why. Lewis said, don't argue about which metaphor is best. I want to go further. I want to commend all of them, because this is a reality that we will never fully comprehend. God the Son, after all, God died for us. It's amazing.
I actually think I read, it took me a while to realize this, but I read, I think, an article that you wrote on the atonement a few years ago, back in I think it's 2019, when you published it, reclaiming all of Paul's R's.
Oh, yeah.
Apostolic atonement by the way of some of the Eastern Fathers.
Right.
Yeah, and that article was really helpful for me a few years ago. I really appreciated it, and that quote by Chrysostom is so good.
And nobody knows it because it's very hard to find an English translation. It's not in any, you have to go to little obscure journals. I actually translated that bit myself because I didn't even find those little obscure journals until after I needed it for that article. So.
Yeah, I actually used your quote because I couldn't find it anywhere else. I mean, your translation, I couldn't find it anywhere else. So I think
I found it in two places, one on the internet and one in an Orthodox journal, but very obscure.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, St. John just always gives us like robust pictures that sometimes
Mhm.
shuts down our reactionary theology, because he's
Exactly.
just giving us these flowery pictures.
Yeah.
And the patristics, they do that. So I appreciate you sharing that. You know, I have sometimes I've was kind of, I wouldn't say a student of, but I was influenced by someone like Dr. R.C. Sproul,
Uh-huh.
you know, which I think people oftentimes are reacting to someone like him. And I think Lewis probably would have reacted a little bit to some of his language, talking about the Father frying singeing and frying the hair of Jesus on
Sure.
the cross, right?
Sure.
And so you don't quite get that in Chrysostom.
No, no,
Uh,
no, no, no. No.
but
And not single-mindedly one picture. Many altogether. And they correct each other. They're self-correcting.
mm,
He's our
and I
God-loving Father who is angry. So we don't have to go with those who say, well, God's anger isn't really anger. It's just the way that we feel his goodness, right? I mean, the wrath of God is a pretty firm concept in the scriptures, but it's not anger like we have. But he's our God-loving Father. Or a man-loving Father. He never takes when you put the two together, they correct each other, I think.
Yeah, I think Saint Augustine and Saint Anthony the Great, they both talk about and deal with the wrath of God, trying to bring us to this, like, approaching it like he's not filled with passion,
No.
unanchored passions, but it's part of his character and holiness. Okay, thank you for that. I know we could talk a lot longer about the atonement, but I always really wanted to touch on Lewis's approach to it, and I thought that was just a great answer. Let's approach another little controversial theme, but it shows up a lot in Lewis. I shouldn't say a lot, but it shows up in important
Um,
places. And that is, he talks about purgation or final purification, and he'll even use the
mhm.
word purgatory in the afterlife. You see it in Great Divorce and other places. What does he mean by that? And I was also intrigued in your book, the way that he talks about the afterlife and purgation in the afterlife or purification. You say, in the Eastern Church on page, guys, buy this book, it's really good. 220, you say this, in the Eastern Church, this idea of post-mortem refinement is not expressed in terms of deficient in merit, nor as an actual place called purgatory. Lewis's refusal then to unequivocal decode his gray town for us is apt and in harmony with Orthodox tendencies. So what do you mean? Unpack a little bit what you think Lewis's view is, and where
So
some
he
of his
won't write. He won't write a purgatorio,
right.
right? But he won't write an inferno. He won't write a purgatorio. He won't write a paradiso. Instead, he wants to show the interrelationship of eternity and time in order to encourage people to think about the significance of what they're doing now. He is not speculating. He is not trying to unpack mysteries that have not been told to us. And actually, even in the Catholic setting, which until quite recently was very strong on purgatory as being an actual place where souls are detained. Even when the Council of Trent maintained that over against reformers who were having difficulty with that teaching, they did say, let the more difficult and subtle questions, which tend not to edify, be set aside, be excluded from popular discourses of the uneducated. So they were aware that there was speculation that went on that was not in the spirit of, can we say, the teaching of the scriptures or of the fathers on this matter of our being purified. So when we get 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where it talks about those who will be saved as though through fire, it's probably a misappropriation of that passage to then posit an actual place of purgatory, an intermediate place between this earth and the final state of blessedness. And we've already said that we're not even looking at our final state of blessedness as something that's static, but it's something that moves on and on. So I think that Lewis's depiction of, I like purgation, the verb, or that's a noun, but a noun that has a verb sense to it, or final purification and actual action, does more justice to the things that we see in scriptures that do suggest that God cares enough about us not to allow us to go into the wedding feast without the appropriate garments, without being clean, right? So, the Council of Trent talked about the debt of temporal punishment that had to be discharged either in this world or in the next. And it's this emphasis upon debt and punishment that I think makes the big difference between what has generally been the Catholic understanding of what they call purgatory and the Orthodox assumption that after death, most of us will still require certain purification before we can see God face to face, before we can be all that we're meant to be. And I do think that the distinction between punishment and purification is a very healthy one. It seems that there's been a movement from the one to the other in Catholic teaching. So you can make a distinction, I think, between the emphasis on punishment in Trent and the emphasis on purification in the White Catechism of today. And yet there remains this difference in approaching this matter between Orthodox and Catholics because of their emphasis upon the juridical, their emphasis upon debt, their emphasis upon the ability for certain merits to weigh the scale so that finally the person could be released from this place, or now they tend to call it more of a process. For Lewis, as for Orthodox, purgatory is certainly not a place, but it is a process by which we can expect to be made fit for eternal life if we're not fit now. And we see his picture of this in The Great Divorce, as those who come in the bus to the beginnings of heaven, the beginnings of paradise, can't even walk on the grass without having pain on their feet because they are insubstantial. It's simply the consequence of who they are over against the reality of God's world. And they also have psychic pain when they come face to face with those who are more real than they are. But in the end, that recognition of their insubstantiality and the ability to be helped and accepting that pain ends up allowing some of them to stay. I think the most beautiful passage in there is the one of the young ghost who has the lizard on his shoulder, always saying smutty things to him, and so lust has become a bondage to him. And in the end, when he allows that to be killed by the angel, it turns into a stallion, and he can go romping off into the high grounds. And the energy, that same energy that was dragging him down, now is unleashed and harnessed in order for him to become what God intends for him to be and to be free. So one example that Lewis gives is of that of being at the dentist, and the end, the tooth is pulled and you're given something to rinse, and the rinse might sting and you spit out the blood, but then you're ready to go. And this is more the Orthodox mindset with regards to what God intends for us afterwards. And we see this in our liturgies when we pray for those who have parted. We see it in some of the discussions of the fathers that God intends to change us, and that this doesn't happen simply in this world, but also in the next.
That's good. Yeah. Tying in this topic with the earlier topic of theosis, his view of purification is transformation. And when you look at when he lets go of the red lizard, he hops onto a stallion. It reminds you of when Lewis will talk about theosis, where he doesn't want to just make you into a horse that can just jump over fences higher. He wants to give you wings, right? Yeah. It reminds you of that. And so it's a beautiful image. And so his view, it really does seem deeply relational, deeply transformational. Theosis is all, union with God's all about that. And so I think he struggled with any kind of depictions that were heavily I think he said that he struggled with Thomas More's depiction, perhaps. I think it was Thomas More's.
Yeah. Another thing that just occurred to me too, thank you for mentioning the wings, I didn't. Another thing that occurs to me is that these things take place in the company and relationship with other people. And so it's not just you and God, and it's not just God measuring your sins and measuring your merits. It's you in communion with others. And it's not just other people paying your debt, it's actual contact with others and having others care for you and help you and pray for you and so on. That brings you into this relationship, just as in our life today. Marriage tends towards theosis. Living in a monastic community tends towards theosis. Learning to restrain oneself in a difficult situation tends towards theosis. We need each other.
Yes, that's so true. The angels and the saints are right there in the foothills of heaven.
Yes.
Transforming. And so I love his depiction. And I think he's really actually deeply influenced Catholic thought today on this very topic. If you ask them about purgatory, most people that I interacted with are giving much more of a C.S. Lewis depiction.
Yeah.
And even Joseph Ratzinger is very similar to this.
Well, sure.
Than the last 400 or 500 years of sit in fire for X, Y, Z amount of time until you're released.
Exactly. And if you read the the New Catechism, it's very clear that that we're going back to the fathers here, and we're dropping or downplaying. I mean, Catholicism never drops. It just kind of puts another layer on top so that you see something else. But what is being emphasized is more the process of being made pure. And that's good.
That's right. Yeah, I one last comment on this. I like how though he's very sad when he's talking about it, in Grief Observed, he talks about how joy, and he's writing this very fresh after she's died. He talks about how she's made landfall, but he's not sure she's made it to a destination yet, her final destination. So he has this. He never wants to fully define it, but he does think that she and many still have this process of perhaps letting go, and being filled up. And grief, he even says grief is a part of that process, which is interesting. St. Mercurius the Great, a Desert Father, says something very similar to that.
Yeah.
Grief, yeah.
I lived through my father's long extended bout with Lewy body dementia. And my dad was a brilliant, exuberant, passionate person. And what I learned from him while I lived through that experience of him being limited about purification was really quite remarkable.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. This process is in this life, and death, it can kind of almost culminate where we're going through a purifying process, not just those who are passing from this life to the next, but even the caregivers.
Yeah.
It's definitely a trying time that requires a lot of the prayers of the saints and the angels. All right, let's talk about our last couple questions here. Lewis has this cosmic vision of salvation history, of the eschaton. It just kind of comes through in his writings, and when I read Orthodox writings, this sort of same cosmic vision comes through. And even when you're worshiping in the divine liturgy, there's this, you're in the cosmos, with Christ as King up there. How does Lewis's vision compare to an Orthodox vision?
So because he had this big view of reality and this delight in the animal kingdom and plants and all that God has put here for us and for us to be a part of and for us to care for, I think that his understanding of what will happen at the end and the finale of salvation is very much in harmony with how Orthodox would see it. When you compare, for example, the commentary on the last half of Romans chapter 8 and compare Augustine and Chrysostom, Augustine understands that this is all about the human being. The human creature is in struggle right now, he says, waiting for the eschaton to come. Whereas St. John Chrysostom reads it as I think is much more natural for the Greek. I mean, ktisis in the Greek can mean ktisis, can mean creature, but more naturally it means creation, the whole of creation. And Chrysostom saw the second half of Romans 8 as a promise that all of the creation would be restored, that there would be a folding up of everything into God's plan, and that he personifies the non-speaking creatures, animals, and plants as all waiting on tiptoe for and anticipating the coming of the sons of God into their own status, to become actually all that God intends for them to be. Because when that happens, the entire creation would be saved. And really, this is the Orthodox view. If you want to know what Orthodoxy has to say about the end of time, look at the last half of Romans 8. It's all just, I think, a footnote and a commentary on that. And so eschatology becomes a great hope, a great anticipation. There's no sense in this view of us looking for special dope or knowledge about a timeline or minute events or what we should look for, and being able to say, Christ is going to return and then there will be a rapture and so on and so forth. Rather, there is a hope for Christ and a confidence that evil will be vanquished while we leave the details to him. In Orthodoxy, it's very unusual to hear talk of a millennium or a rapture and so on, and arguments about whether the rapture would be before or after a tribulation and so on. We understand that already we're reigning with Christ, but already the tribulation is going on. And that certainly would be the way that Lewis would see our situation here. So the most natural place to look for this with Lewis would be in the last battle, where the temporal Narnia is left behind, but found beyond the stable door to be reclaimed and reborn in the true Narnia, that true land of Aslan, where everything and everyone that can be saved will be. Everything surrounds Aslan and the Narnia stories from beginning to end. Everything turns to the God and his till we have faces. And when we look at the scriptures, everything surrounds the throne in Revelation 4:5, where also the Lamb sits, where there are the 4 mysterious angelic creatures and the 24 elders and the hosts of angels and the saints, as well as all the creatures. And we have icons of this, all worshiping the God of life and redemption. And it doesn't matter whether we're here on this earth or whether there are those who are present with Christ in the heavenlies. We are just one body doing that kind of worship. So, I think there is a sense in Lewis in which our world leads ineluctably and naturally into the next, even though death must intervene. And what we do here in the body then matters. It really matters. And that's true for Orthodox as well. It really matters what we do. That's clear in Lewis's cosmic trilogy, and it's also clear in the Gospels. It's clear in Paul, who says, don't sins that are in the body that will affect the whole of you. And it's true in the Apocalypse. And I think the resurrection of Jesus makes it evident that there is a link between the creation and the new creation. As you and I are talking here today, is actually Holy Spirit Day. And he and his presence in us and in the church is a token of that link between the world that we now believe ourselves to live in and the world that is really our home, and that will include the world that we're in now. Every time I read The Last Battle, when I'm reading it out loud to kids, I get choked up, because I see that this is not just an end to the story, but it's a picture that he's trying to give of that growing bliss that goes on and on, that heaven isn't static, that there's a recapturing of everything that was good. And that makes me yearn for my love and my knowledge to grow, and to be in not a static but a dynamic situation where God will continue to bless us and make us more what we are supposed to be, so that we'll have the wherewithal to bless the rest of the new creation. I don't know how that's going to be, but it's a lot bigger picture than just simply saying, okay, the end is coming and everything will be okay. It's huge.
Yeah. It's cosmic in scope. And I think it's so important in today's world where the sinful desires are being pitched every which way to our kids and to us. And we need to give them a world where not their sinful desires, but their, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, and patience, and all the fruit are being stirred up and excited for what's to come.
Right.
And I think,
And without saying that the natural pleasures of this world are wrong,
right.
right? They're just put in their place.
Yes, yes. I think kids pick that up in Narnia and Middle Earth because there's high feasts, which we had a big, huge feast for Pentecost yesterday. International, all these people bringing different dishes, and it felt like a high feast. It was
Yep.
just joy. And I'm like, this feels like heaven, a little slice of heaven, which is great. And you get that when you read Lewis in Narnia. And you also have a children's fiction book or books.
Two.
I've
I
two.
have
What are the
two.
titles for our audience so they
So the
can check them
first
out?
one is called Beyond the White Fence, and the second is called Down the Valley. And both of them involve children of a large extended family, you can guess who they're based on, who go down behind their grandmother's white fence in the cultivated part of the yard down into the valley, and they're whisked away in time and space, and they meet their saints. And they have adventures with them, and there are some scary moments and some really exciting moments, and at the same time there's drama going on in the family, and so that's happening. In the second book there's a baby being born, and in the first, and also there's a question of adoption in the second book. And in the first book, the younger boy feels like he's being excluded by the girls. So the first book is for a little bit younger crowd, maybe 7 through 13, and the second is for maybe 8 or 9 through 15, because it deals with more substantive issues. But in all of them, what I'm wanting to do is to open the eyes of kids to the bigness of the world in which we live. That this isn't just religious stuff. This is these were real people like me, and they have real problems like I do.
Well, I need to make a couple purchases today because we need to integrate those fictional works into our Orthodox homeschool curriculum for my children. I have 6 kids, many ages, and we're always looking for fiction that they can read because, some of it's amazing and some of it's not amazing. And so
No, that's right.
we need a lot more Orthodox writers using their imagination to
some of it's
accompany our
too
children.
pedantic. It's too, I'm using this story to teach you a lesson. And I
Right.
didn't want them to be that. I want them just to be an amazing eye-opening experience for the kids, because they were for me when I wrote them.
Well, this is a question that I don't really like asking, but I think it's necessary. And the question is, what are some of the things that Lewis said that wouldn't be in harmony with Orthodox theology, or perhaps hesitancies he had personally about maybe certain ideas? I think it's important to have this question so that we can kind of shake him out a little bit and not over glorify him.
No, absolutely. And he wouldn't want that. So, obviously, the most obvious one is the doctrine of the church, ecclesiology. He has this idea that the church is like a house with different denominational rooms. And I'm glad he says don't live in the hallways, like give yourself to the room that you're in. And I'm also glad that he did not, in his writing, accentuate the eccentricities of Anglicanism of any brand. But he did seek to write on those things that were non-controversial so that he can be read by people across who name Christ, across the denominations, and across the communions. But of course, because he has this idea of what we would call the branch theory, he doesn't have an importance of the historic continuity of the church. He certainly does have an idea of the communion of saints, and he talks about how we belong one to the other. But I don't think he's not, because of his ecclesiology, able to see the ongoing apostolic tradition. For him, the great tradition would be important, but I don't think he would have an idea of holy tradition coming right up to today. I'd like to see a lot more explicit things on the Theotokos. I wish he had actually written on confession rather than just practiced it personally, and so on. So it's in that area, I think, where he's certainly not Orthodox. And yet, because he was seeing a confessor regularly, and a couple of things that he had to say about the Holy Virgin, and his love for the fathers, those that he knew, do make me realize that in his imagination he yearned for a different ecclesiology, though he could not express it. So that would be my major thing with him. I think too, sometimes out of reaction, I don't really want to end on this note, but it just came to mind. I think that occasionally he does caricature the role of women in a way that I don't think is extremely helpful, but not always. And certainly his time with Joy and his writing of Till We Have Faces shows that he was able to take women with utter seriousness, and I appreciate that. But there's a couple of points in which he sounds like he accepts what Milton had to say when he was doing an exegesis of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, that man is the glory of God, and man is made in the image of God, and woman is made in the image of man, which is not what Paul says. He talks about glory, and I don't think that glory and image are the same. So, but that's very minor, and I think that as an old bachelor, we should be absolutely shocked that he could come up with such robust characters as he did Until We Have Faces. Not just Orwell and Psyche, who are not just symbolic, but persons in their own right, but also Rediville and Bardia's wife. These figures actually make the male figures pale in comparison. They ring so true. So I think his imagination was greater than sometimes his actual writing in this way. But I don't want to end on that note because I don't think it's important. I do think that the ecclesiology is that's the major distinction between Lewis's understanding of Christianity and Orthodoxy. We have an incarnational view of the church, and he had a much more theoretical view of the whole community of everybody who names Christ, and we're all in different rooms of the house.
Now today, you see a number of people in his country, his area of the world. Really, it seems like discovering Orthodoxy.
Yes.
You think of someone like Paul Kingsnorth. You think of other writers and imaginative type of people who are also critically thinking about our world and culture and society. And it makes you wonder, would Lewis in 2024 be considering Orthodoxy or not? It's a different question than whether he'd be Orthodox, but right now in this moment, would he be wrestling with it more, or would he be Orthodox by now or never?
I can't imagine how he could have continued in Anglicanism with the novelties that have been introduced. I mean, let alone women in the priesthood and in the episcopate, the sexual mores that are being accepted as naturalized. I cannot imagine how he couldn't have gone. He might have gone Catholic because that's more natural in Britain. I don't know, but I can't imagine him staying Anglican. I just can't.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would have killed him. But I mean, Orthodoxy is becoming better known. I think he has. He had a view of the incarnational aspect of Orthodoxy that actually should challenge us in Orthodoxy today. He might have found the ethnic flavor of many Orthodox churches to be off-putting. That should challenge us to be thinking about how do we, in a day that loves novelty, and in a day that's always looking for something new, how do we allow an authentic British or an authentic American Orthodoxy to come about that isn't constantly looking back to the old country while it retains its love and devotion and debt to those who have established Orthodoxy in this land or in Britain.
And the saints challenge us to do that as well. Saint Cyril, Methodius, they challenge us to bring the gospel to our world. And it's already, for someone who packs up his van with a bunch of kids and travels, farther than we've ever, traveled to a church. Thankfully ours is in English, but if we were traveling an hour and a half to go to one that was in a different language, it would be even harder. So it's helpful to at least, challenge ourselves and critique ourselves to how can we make this a better bridge. So, well, Dr. Edith Humphrey, thank you so much for coming on. I think we have time. Let me see if we've got any questions and answers coming in.
One quick correction. My
Yes.
website is edithmhumphrey.com.
Oh, thank you. I've got that link in the description of this video, so you can click on that and go right to her website. I'm also going to make sure that I have all of your books, and I'm going to place the further up and further in on the top of the list, and then your fictional ones right below that, and then I'll have your other works there so people can find them really quickly, and so people can find all of that. So thank you so much for pointing out all those amazing resources. I'll even throw out on that article about the atonement on there too, so people can find that, since we referenced that as well. We've had about 20 people watching live this whole time, which is great. Go ahead and throw a question in there if you have a question, and we can answer it right now. I actually don't have a question at the moment from our live audience, or at least it hasn't been kicked in here yet. I'll give you guys 30 seconds to jump in and throw in a question, but I want to make sure that our time with you is precious. Anything you want to plug? Anything that you want to advertise? Book coming out? You just had a book too, right?
Yeah. I have my most recent adult book is called Mediation and the Immediate God, and it's about the whole question of why do we mediate for each other, and how do Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox together negotiate arguments that we have about mediation across the divide of death. So that's a small little book, and it was, tested in Baptist circles. So I wanted it very much to be a conversation. The other thing is, starting this Friday, every other week, my podcast and blog on A Lamp for Today is going to start a new series called Light from and Upon the Knowable Books. And it's on the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanon, depending on whether you're Protestant or Catholic, or as we call them, the knowable books. And so that's going to be a lot of fun. We'll be looking at the extra bits of Daniel and Esther, and we're going to be looking at Sirach and the Maccabees and just all those Tobit, all those really fun, interesting books.
I'm excited about that. That's going to be great. I'm gonna advertise that. That's going to be a very exciting, because you don't see that happen very often. Someone actually it's talked a lot about, but someone actually working through the books themselves. You don't find a lot of those resources. So that's wonderful. When I was a Protestant, I fell in love with the book of Sirach. So the plan
will be to show the... Oh, it's gorgeous. Yeah. So going through and showing connections with the Old and the New Testament, and commenting on why this book was maybe dumped by the Protestants, why it was problematic, but also what they're missing. They're missing kind of the familial, intimate aspects of the faith without these books.
And sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there. I think there was just a slight delay in the video footage, so then there was a little interruption there. So sorry about that. Well, I don't think we have any questions from the audience today, so I'm going to have to get on my audience next time to make sure that they
will convince them all.
Yes.
No questions.
Your answers were so wonderful and robust with all these topics that I think maybe they just were like, oh, wow, I'm all good. So, well, Dr. Edith Humphrey, thank you so much for coming on to the Barrel Age Faith. Really love having you on, and we're going to make sure people are going to your website and checking out all the wonderful things that you're doing. And if you haven't gotten, again, this book, Further Up and Further In, Orthodox Conversations with C.S. Lewis in Scripture and Theology, definitely check it out. I really have enjoyed reading this book, particularly if you're a Lewis Narnia fan. You're gonna love it.
Thank you.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to this video, and we'll be sure to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.